On January 30, 1933, I entered Wilhelmstrasse, filled with deep concern for the future of my people. Today, 6 years later, I can speak to the First Reichstag in Greater Germany. Truly, perhaps more than another generation, we may be able to gauge the pious meaning of the saying, "What a turn of God's providence." 6 years were enough to fulfill the dreams of centuries. A year to bring our people into the enjoyment of that unity that was the feudal aspiration of many generations. As I see you today gathered around me as representatives of our German people from all parts of the empire, and know among you the newly elected men of the Ostmark and the Sudetenland, I again relishes the tremendous impressions of the events of a year in which centuries were realized. How much blood flowed around this destination in vain? How many millions of German men, consciously or unconsciously in the service of this purpose, have gone the bitter road of rapid or painful death for more than 1,000 years? How many others were condemned to end life behind fortress and dungeon walls that they wanted to give to Greater Germany? How many hundreds of thousands have flowed into the wide world as an endless stream of German emigration, driven by distress and anxiety? For decades thinking of the unfortunate homeland, after generations forgetting it. And now, in 1 year, the realization of this dream has succeeded. Not without a fight, as thoughtless citizens may believe it. Before this year of German unification, there are almost 2 decades of the fanatical struggle of a political idea. Hundreds of thousands and millions use their entire being, their physical and economic existence for them. Took mockery as willingly as years of shameful treatment, pathetic slander, and barely bearable terror. Countless blood-covered dead and injured in all German districts are the witnesses of the fight. And moreover, this success was fought for by an immense volitional effort, and by the power of brave and fanatical decisions. I express this because there is the danger that those who have the least practical share in the success of German unification are only too likely to claim the deed of creating this empire as the most lucrative declamators, or the whole event of the year 1938 as a long overdue, but unfortunately accepted by National Socialism, late accepted as matter of course. To these elements, I would like to say that the enforcement of this year included a nervous force, of which such weights do not have a trace. These are the old, incorrigible pessimists, skeptics, or indifferent people, whom we have always been able to miss as a positive element during our 20-year struggle, but who now believe they must make their critical marginal notes after winning the nomination of the national experts. Review of 1938. In a few sentences I give a factual account of the historical events of the memorable year 1938. On Friday evening, March 11, 1938, the request was made to me, in order to prevent obvious inner confusion in this country, to give the order to invade the German troops. Already at 10 o'clock at night the border crossings took place in numerous places. From 6 o'clock in the morning began the general invasion, which took place under the immense rejoicing of a now finally liberated population. Then came the Sudeten crisis. the responsible man for that development, which gradually made Czechoslovakia the exponent of all hostile intentions directed against the Reich, was the former president of the Republic, Beneš. He had, at the suggestion, and with the participation of certain foreign circles in May of last year, the Czech mobilization was carried out, based on the intention to provoke firstly the German Reich, and secondly to inflict on the German Reich a defeat in its international reputation. The fictitious report of a German mobilization allegedly forcing Czechoslovakia to mobilize its armed forces was maintained and propagated, despite an official declaration twice conveyed at my bidding to the Czech state president Beneš, stating that Germany had not mobilized even a single soldier, and in spite of identical assertions to representatives of foreign powers. Insistent demands called for Germany to countermand the fictitious mobilization order and to renounce its pretenses. Beneš labored to spread the rumor that the determined nature of the steps he had taken had forced the German Reich back within its appropriate borders. Since the Reich had neither mobilized its forces, nor entertained any intentions of attacking Czechoslovakia, this situation entailed without a doubt a serious loss of prestige for the Reich. Because of this unbearable provocation, which was intensified by a truly infamous persecution and terrorization of our Germans there, I decided to finally, and now radically resolve the Sudetengerman question. I gave on May 28, 1. The order to prepare the military intervention against this state with the date of 2 October, 2. I ordered the massive and accelerated expansion of our defense front in the West. For the confrontation with Mr. Beneš and for the protection of the Reich against other interference attempts, or even threats, the immediate mobilization of at first 96 divisions was intended, which could follow in a short time a larger number of further such federations. If certain newspapers and politicians in the rest of the world now claim that Germany had thereby threatened other peoples with military blackmail, this is due to a gross distortion of the facts. In an area where neither Englishmen nor other Western nations have anything to look for, Germany has established the right of self-determination for 10 million German nationals. It did not threaten anyone, it only defended itself against the attempt of third-party intervention. And I do not need to assure you, my deputies, men of the German Reichstag, that we will not accept it in the future, that in certain matters, which are only for us, Western states simply try to get into it, to arrive at natural and sensible solutions by intervening prevent. We were all happy, therefore, that thanks to the initiative of our friend Benito Mussolini, and thanks to Chamberlain's and Daladier's high degree of appreciation, we succeeded in finding the elements of an agreement that allowed not only the peaceful resolution of an urgent matter, but beyond can be taken as an example for the possibility of a general rational treatment and resolution of certain vital problems. However, without the determination to resolve this problem one way or another, Such an agreement of the European powers would not have come about to find the elements of an agreement that not only allowed the peaceful resolution of an urgent matter, but could also serve as an example of the possibility of a general rational treatment and resolution of certain vital problems. However, without the determination to resolve this problem one way or another, such an agreement of the European powers would not have come about to find the elements of an agreement that not only allowed the peaceful resolution of an urgent matter, but could also serve as an example of the possibility of a general rational treatment and resolution of certain vital problems. However, without the determination to resolve this problem one way or another, such an agreement of the European powers would not have come about. 1938. History-making moment. The unification of Germany. We have before us today a representation of the German people, which can claim to be regarded as a truly constitutional body. The politically and socially disorganized German people of earlier decades has consumed most of their inherent powers in an inferior as well as unreasonable internal war. The so-called democratic freedom of living out of opinions and instincts did not lead to a development, or even to the liberation of special values or powers, but only to their senseless waste, and finally to the paralysis of any truly creative personality that still exists. By putting an end to this unfruitful struggle, National Socialism redeemed the forces that had hitherto been internally bound, and made them free to represent the national interests of life in the sense of coping with great communal tasks within the Reich. Mission ahead. It is nonsensical to think that obedience and discipline are necessary only for soldiers, but have little useful meaning in the rest of the people's lives. On the contrary, the disciplined and obediently popular community is capable of mobilizing forces that facilitate an easier assertion of the people's existence, and thus serve the successful representation of the interests of all. However, such a community is primarily not created by the compulsion of violence, but only by the compelling power of an idea, and thus by the efforts of a continuous education. There are people to whom even the greatest and most devastating events cannot overcome any inner thoughtfulness, or even movement. These are personally internally dead, and thus worthless for a community. They do not make history themselves, and you cannot make history with them. In their narrowness, or in their blatant decadence, they are a useless commodity of nature. They find their own reassurance, or satisfaction in the thought of a sublime attitude, or rather, ignorance, due to their supposed wisdom, or wisdom over the events of time. One can very well imagine that a people does not possess a single such ignoramus, and thereby is capable of the greatest actions and deeds. But it is impossible to conceive of, or even lead a nation that would consist in its majority of such ignoramuses, rather than the bloody mass of idealistic, believing, and affirming people. These are the only valuable elements of a national community. 1,000 weaknesses are to be forgiven them, if they only have the one strength to give for an ideal, or an idea, if necessary, even the last. My honorable members, we are still facing tremendous, enormous tasks. A new leadership layer of our people must be built. Their composition is racial, but it is also necessary. through the system and the nature of our education, to demand and ensure above all bravery and responsibility as a natural prerequisite for the assumption of every public office, for the occupation of leading positions in state and party. The attitude of character is to be valued higher than the so-called merely scientific or supposed mental fitness. For wherever there is a need to be led, it is not the abstract knowledge that decides, but the innate ability to lead and, consequently, a high degree of responsibility, and thus of determination, courage and perseverance. Basically, there must be a recognition that the lack of a sense of responsibility can never be outweighed by a presumed first-class, testified scientific education. Knowledge and leadership, that means also energy, are not mutually exclusive. Wherever doubt arises, knowledge can under no circumstances be considered a substitute for attitude, courage, bravery, and determination. In the leadership of a national community in party and state, these characteristics are the more important ones. When I say this in front of you, members of parliament, I am under the impression of the 1 year of German history that has taught me more than all my life so far about how important and irreplaceable these virtues are, and how in the critical hours a single energetic man weighs more and more than 1,000 clever weaklings. This new selection of leaders must be redeemed as a social phenomenon, but also from numerous prejudices, which I can really call no other than a lying, and in the deepest nonsensical social morality. There is no attitude that could not find its ultimate justification in the benefits it gives to the whole. What is unimportant, or even harmful to the existence of the whole cannot be regarded as morality in the service of a social order. And above all, a national community is only conceivable under the recognition of laws, which are valid for all, i.e. it is not possible to expect, or demand of one the following of principles, which in the eyes of the others are either absurd, harmful or even seem unimportant. German concept of socialism. I have no understanding of the tendency of dying social strata to separate themselves from real life through a hedge of dried up and unrealized civil status laws in order to artificially preserve themselves. On the other hand, as long as this only happens in order to ensure a peaceful cemetery for your own death, there is nothing wrong with it. But if you want to present a barrier to progressing life, then the storm of a youth with a rushing forwards will quickly eliminate this old scrub. Today's German people's state knows no social prejudices. He therefore knows no social special morality. He only knows the laws of life, and necessities conceived by reason and knowledge of man. The unity of the German national body, whose guarantor you, my deputies, are and will be in the first place, gives me the certainty that, whatever tasks will be assigned to our people, the National Socialist state sooner or later will dissolve. However, whatever the difficulties we may face, the energy and courage of the leadership will master them. 1. We are really fighting a tremendous battle, using all the strength and energy of our people and people too. We will win this fight completely. Yes, we have already won it. Germany still facing grave crisis. What is the cause of all our economic difficulties? In the overpopulation of our habitat. And here I can hold only one fact, and one question to the gentlemen critics in the Western and non-European democracies. The fact that the German people live with 135 people on the square kilometer without any external help, and without all the reserves of former times. Plundered by the rest of the world for 1.5 decades. Burdened with enormous debts, without colonies, it is still nourished and clothed and has no one employed. And the question, which of our so-called big democracies would be able to accomplish the same feat? Of course, if nature lets the bananas grow into their mouths, they have a better life struggle than the German farmer, who has to toil all year to cultivate his field. All we are doing is confess that now such a carefree international banana picker criticizes the activities of the German farmer. The then occurring state can only be overcome in two ways. 1. By additional imports of foodstuffs, i.e. an increase in the export of German products, taking into account that some of the raw materials for these products must be imported from abroad, leaving only part of the trade results for the purchase of food. Or 2. The expansion of the living space of our people in order to ensure the problem of German nutrition in the internal cycle of our economy. Since the second solution is not given at the moment due to the continuing blindness of the former victorious powers, we are forced to deal with the first one, i.e. we have to export to buy food, and, secondly, we have to, partly because of this export raw materials that we do not own ourselves need to be exported even more in order to additionally secure these raw materials for our economy. This constraint is therefore not a capitalist, as may be the case in other countries, but the hardships that can hit a people, namely the concern for the daily bread. And if hereby foreign statesmen with, I do not know for what, economic countermeasures threatened, so I can only assure you that in such a case, an economic desperate struggle would begin, which is very easy to fight through for us. Easier than for the oversaturated other nations, because the motive for our economic struggle would be a very simple, namely, German people live, i.e. export, or die. And I can assure all international doubters, the German people will not die, by no means, but it will live. If necessary, it will provide its leadership with the entire workforce of the new National Socialist community in order to take up and fight through such a struggle. But as far as leadership is concerned, however, a final solution to this problem, and in a reasonable sense, will only come when general human reason prevails over the greed of individual peoples. That is, when one has come to understand that insistence on injustice is not only political, also economically useless, indeed insane. Under the circumstances that now exist, there is no other way for us than to continue an economic policy that must try to bring out of the given living space the highest. This requires an ever greater increase in our services, and an increase in production. This forces us to intensify our 4-year plan. But it also leads to the mobilization of more and more workers. This brings us closer to a new phase of German economic policy. While the goal of our economic management in the first 6 years of our seizure of power was to bring all idle labor into some useful employment, It is the task in the years ahead to undertake a careful survey of our workforce, to regularize their use by one rationalization and, above all, technically better organization of our working conditions with the same work effort to achieve increased benefits, and thus also save labor for new additional productions. This, in turn, forces us to release the capital market to a greater extent for the technical expansion of our enterprises, and thus relieve us of the state requirements. But all of this again leads to the need for a sharp combination of economy and finance. It is my decision to conclude the path already taken, since January 30, 1937, of transforming the German Reichsbank from an internationally influenced banking company into the Music Institute of the German Reich. If the rest of the world complains in part that another German enterprise would lose the traits of an international nature, it is only said that it is our inexorable decision to lend all facilities of our life first and foremost German, that is, National Socialist traits, and the rest of the world would only have to see how absurd it is to reproach us. We wish to impose German ideas on the other world, and how much more justified it would be if National Socialist Germany tried to lament that the other world was still trying to impose their views on us. I now see it, my deputies of the Reichstag, as the duty of every German man and every German woman to understand the leadership of the Reich in its economic policy, and to support it by all means. In town and country, above all, it should be borne in mind that the basis of German economic policy is not to be found in any financial theories at all, but in a very primitive production knowledge, that is, in understanding of the all-important level of goods production. It is regrettable, but not changeable, that additional tasks have to be set for us, that is, that we must employ a large percentage of our national labor for the in itself inefficient armaments of our people. Need for German military power ultimately, the economy of today's empire stands and falls with foreign policy security. It is better to see this in good time than too late. I therefore consider it the supreme task of the National Socialist leadership to do everything humanly possible to strengthen our military strength. I build on the insight of the German people, and especially on his memory. We have no right to suppose that, if Germany ever succumbed to another seizure in the future, its fate would take on a different shape. On the contrary, it is in part even the same men who once threw into the world the great war fire, and that endeavor today, as driving forces, or as driven agents in the service of international sedition, to increase enmity so as to prepare a new fight. And above all you, especially my deputies, men of the Reichstag, do not forget one thing. In certain democracies, it seems that one of the special prerogatives of political democratic life is the artificially breeding of hatred of the so-called totalitarian states. That is to raise public opinion against peoples that displace others through a flood of partly disfiguring, partly even fictitious reports did not harm people, and did not want to harm them, who were at most themselves deprived of brave injustice for decades. If we defend ourselves against such war apostles as Mr. Duff Cooper, Mr. Eden, Churchill or Mr. Ikes, etc., then this is considered an interference in the sacred rights of democracies. In the opinion of these gentlemen, they have the right to attack other peoples and their leaders, but no one has the right to resist it. I do not need to assure them that as long as the German Reich is a sovereign state, the state leadership will not allow an English or American politician to forbid them to respond to such attacks. But the fact that we remain a sovereign state will be ensured in the future by the weapons we are forging, and we will ensure that through the number of our friends. In itself, one could dismiss the assertion that Germany intends to attack America with a single laugh. And one would like to ignore the continuous propaganda campaign of certain British war apostles, but we must not neglect the following. 1. These democracies are states whose political construction makes it possible that just a few months later these worst warmongers can hold in their hands the leadership of the government. 2. Therefore, we owe it to the security of the Reich to enlighten the German people in good time about these men. Since the German people felt no hatred of England, America, or France, but wanted their peace and quiet, but these peoples continued to be spurred on by their Jewish or non-Jewish agitators against Germany and the German people. In the event of the intentions of these advocates of war, our own people into a psychologically unprepared and therefore inexplicable situation. I therefore think it necessary that from now on in our propaganda and in our press the attacks should always be answered and, above all, brought to the attention of the German people. It must know who the men are who want to break a war under all circumstances. I am of the conviction that the calculation of these elements is a false one, for when the National Socialist propaganda first passes to the answer, we will be as successful as we in the inner Germany, even by the compelling force of our propaganda thrown the Jewish enemy of the world to the ground to have. The peoples will realize in a short time that National Socialist Germany does not want hostility to other peoples, that all the assertions about the intentions of our people to attack foreign peoples are either morbidly hysterical or out of the personal self-preservation addiction of individual politicians, but that lies in certain states conscienceless thieves should serve to save their finances, and that, above all, international Jewry may hope to achieve satisfaction in their vindictiveness and greed for profit, but that they represent the monstrous slander that can be done to a great and peace-loving people. American aggression vs. Germany in World War I, for example. German soldiers have never fought on American soil except in the service of American independence and liberation struggles, but American soldiers have been brought to Europe to help stifle a great nation struggling to free itself. It was not Germany that attacked America, but America Germany, and as the Commission of Inquiry of the American House of Representatives has stated, without any compelling cause, only for capitalist reasons. Jewish question and Western hypocrisy about Jewish immigration. Everyone should be aware of one thing. These attempts, above all, cannot in the least affect Germany in the settlement of his Jewish question. I would like to say the following about the Jewish question. It is a shameful spectacle to see today how the whole world drags pity on democracy, and how hard-hearted it is for the poor, and tormented Jewish people in view of the obvious duty to help. The arguments used to apologize for non-assistance speak only for us Germans and Italians. Because one says, 1. We, the democracies, are not in a position to take in the Jews. There are still 10 people per square kilometer in these world empires, while Germany has 135 to feed on the square kilometer, but still be able to do so. 2. It is asserted, we cannot take you unless you get from Germany a certain amount of capital to immigration. However, Germany was good enough to absorb these elements for centuries, even though they had nothing but contagious political and sanitary diseases. What this people has today, it has acquired at the expense of the not-so-cunning German people through the worst manipulations. Today we only make up for what has caused this people themselves. Western murder of German civilians and other war crimes when the rest of the world took away the foreign capital of the German people, when they took all the colonial possessions, the philanthropic considerations of the democratic statesmen apparently had no decisive influence. Today, I can only assure these gentlemen that, thanks to the brutal education that the democracies have bestowed upon us for 15 years, we are completely hardened to all sentimental tendencies. We have seen that, after more than 800,000 children died of hunger and food shortages at the end of the war, almost 1 million pieces of dairy cows were driven away after the cruel paragraphs of a dictate imposed by the democratic, humane world apostles impose us as a peace treaty. We have seen that 1 year after the end of the war, more than 1 million German prisoners of war were detained without any reason in captivity. We had to endure that far more than 1.5 million Germans from their frontier areas were being wrenched from their belongings and whipped almost exclusively with what they carried on their bodies. We have endured the loss of millions of our fellow citizens without hearing them, or giving them even the slightest chance of further preserving their lives. I could add dozens of the most gruesome examples to those examples. So stay tuned with humanity. The German people do not want their interests to be determined and governed by a foreign people. France to the French, England to the English, America to the Americans, and Germany to the Germans. More on Jewish question, we are determined to stop the nesting of a foreign people that has been able to seize all leadership, and to deport this people. Because we are willing to educate our own people for these leadership positions. We have hundreds of thousands of the brightest peasant and working children. We will have them educated, and we are already educating them, and we would like them to once occupy the leading positions in the state with our other educated classes, not the families of a people we do not know. Above all, however, German culture is, as its name implies, German and not Jewish, and its administration and care are therefore placed in the hands of our people. But if the rest of the world cries out with hypocritical expression over this barbaric expulsion of such an irreplaceable, culturally valuable element from Germany, then we can only be amazed at the consequences that are drawn from it. For how should we be thankful that we release these magnificent cultural bearers, and make them available to the other world? She cannot, according to her own statements, give a reason for apology, which is why she refuses to admit these most valuable people to her countries. It is also difficult to see why the members of this race are otherwise being expected to serve the German people, but in the countries so swarming for these splendid people, they suddenly refuse to accept it under all possible excuses. I believe that this problem will be solved all the better, because Europe cannot calm down until the Jewish question is resolved. It may very well be that sooner or later there will be an agreement in Europe on this problem, even between nations that would otherwise not find their way together. The world has sufficient settlement space, but it must finally be broken with the opinion that the Jewish people are destined by God to be, in a certain percentage, benefactors of the body and of the productive work of other peoples. Judaism will have to adapt to solid building activity as other peoples do, or it will sooner or later succumb to a crisis of unimaginable proportions. And one thing I would like to say at this perhaps not only for us Germans memorable days. I've been a prophet in my life very often, and was mostly laughed at. At the time of my struggle for power, it was primarily the Jewish people who only accepted my prophecies with laughter. Once in Germany I would take over the leadership of the state, and thus of the entire people, and then, among many others, the Jewish problem brings solution. I believe that this laudable laughter, meanwhile, has stifled Judaism in Germany already in the throat. Threat to kill Jews today. I want to be a prophet again. If international financial Jewry in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the peoples once again into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Judaism, but annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. For the time of the propagandistic defenselessness of non-Jewish peoples is over. National Socialist Germany and Fascist Italy possess those institutions which, if necessary, may enlighten the world of the nature of a question which is instinctively conscious to many peoples, and only scientifically unclear. At present, Judaism may, in certain states, conduct its incitement under the protection of a press, film, radio propaganda, the theater, literature, etc., which it holds in its possession. But if this people succeeds again, the masses of millions of people should be united to rush for this completely meaningless, and only Jewish interests fight, then the effectiveness of an enlightenment will express itself, which is completely succumbed to the Judaism in Germany already in few years. The peoples no longer want to die on the battlefields to earn this ruthless international race in the business of war, and satisfy their Old Testament vengeance. On the Jewish slogan, proletarians of all countries, unite, will win a higher realization, namely, creating members of all nations, recognize your common enemy. Not opposed to churches. One of the allegations raised in the so-called democracies against Germany is that National Socialist Germany is an anti-religious state. I would like to make the following solemn declaration to the entire German people. 1. In Germany no one has been persecuted because of his religious attitude, nor will anyone be prosecuted. 2. Since January 30, 1933, The National Socialist State has made the following sums available to the two churches in terms of public tax revenues through its state organs. In the financial year 1933, Rm 130 million. In the financial year 1934, Rm 170 million. In the financial year 1935, Rm 250 million. In the financial year 1936, Rm 320 million. In the financial year 1937, Rm 400 million. In the financial year 1938, Rm 500 million. In addition, about 85 million Reichsmark annually from grants from the lender, and about 7 million Reichsmark from grants from the municipalities and associations of municipalities. Besides, the churches are the largest landowners in the state. The value of their land and forestry possessions exceeds about 10 billion Reichsmarks. The income from this property is estimated at over 300 million a year.